Hello everyone, my name is Jeff Biesbauer, Content Manager at Agiloft. Welcome to today's training webinar titled Take Control of Roles and Permissions. Today's broadcast is a recorded update by Rose Booble of a hugely popular session delivered by Agiloft Implementation Manager Jack Wicks at the Agiloft Summit last October. It'll focus on how you can use roles and permissions to enhance security and productivity in Agiloft. The presentation will be about 35 minutes, followed by a live Q&A with Jack. Please submit any questions in the appropriate window in the GoToWebinar platform at any time during the presentation. It takes us about a minute to queue up the presentation, so please bear with us as we do that.
Hello everyone, my name is Rose Booble and I am an implementer with Agiloft. Today I will be presenting on behalf of Jack Wicks, who is an implementation manager with the company. We're going to take a look at roles and permissions and how to leverage both within your Agiloft system. And after the presentation, there will be time for a Q&A session. So let's take a quick look at what we'll be going over today. Today's presentation will look at three overall categories. First, we will look at groups and teams, how they differ, and how they combine to form the overall permission structure in Agiloft. Next, we'll examine roles and how roles create an effective way of combining the use of groups and teams. And finally, we'll look at some examples of how roles fit into the larger idea of permissions and how they can be leveraged to implement different permission structures, including confidential records. I want to briefly touch on two things that will be critical for you to see before we move into the larger presentation. First, let's talk briefly about saved searches. A saved search uses a set of predefined search criteria and makes those criteria available across all aspects of a table. For example, a saved search could be used to filter the records that a user has permission to edit. In the image you see here, the saved search shows all records that have a status of active, signed, or expired, and for which the requester ID matches the ID of the user who is currently logged in. This would allow you to search for all contracts for which you are the requester that are in one of these three statuses, and would be customized for each user, since it uses the global variable instead of matching to a specific employee record. The second thing I want to touch on before we jump in is the user record. So this is what a user record looks like in Agiloft. Every user with access to the system has one, and there are a few key aspects of the record that we will be looking at. You can see that each user has a login and a password, and then they also have a primary team and a group. They also have a field called current roles, which we will be looking at in just a little bit. So this is just so that you have an idea of the structure of a user record and what important elements of that record play into permissions and visibility as we move forward. So we're now going to jump into the body of our content, and we'll start by looking at groups and teams and the primary function of each. So a group defines what you can see and what you can edit. For example, someone in the contract creator group may only be able to see their own contracts. A user can be in multiple groups, and if they are, they see the most extensive permission for each element of each table based on a combination of the group's permissions. A user who is in the contract creator group, which can see all contracts and edit their own, and the contract department administrator group, which can both see and edit all the contracts for their department, would be able to see all contracts and edit all contracts in their department since that is the superset of the most extensive permissions of the groups in which they are listed. Teams define how to see Agiloft. For example, a legal team could see the legal dashboard and have quick access to the legal relevant tables in the left pane. While the team describes what elements are visible, the group still defines the records that the user has permission to see or interact with within each of those elements. In order to access the system, each user has to have at least one team to determine the structure of what they see, and at least one group to determine the records they can see within that structure. They also have to have a primary team defined. To manage groups and teams, we will need to access the Setup menu. From here, we'll navigate to the Access menu. And then once we are in the Access section, we can select either group or team. And once we're looking at the group or team list, we will simply edit the corresponding record by clicking the Edit icon to the left of the group or team record. Now that we are in a group record, let's take a look at the Group Setup wizard. As we go through this wizard, we will see what in the system is configured by a user's group's permissions, and we'll do the same for teams afterwards. So, in the first General tab of the Group wizard, we can choose whether the group is an end user or a power user group. We can see that this particular group is an end user group. The simplest distinction for end users is that they access the system through the end user interface and can only edit their own records. From here, we can also select whether this group can send themselves a password reset email from the login page. Now let's look at the other options available for this tab for a power user group. From here, we can set whether the users can personalize their left pane. This permission allows users to control the content and order of tables that they can view along the left side of the system. We can also select whether the users can modify chart collections, and this will allow users to change which charts they can see when they navigate to the Chart Collections menu from the Home section of the left pane. Chart collections allow users to group commonly used charts into a single set that can be generated with one click. By enabling this permission, you can allow users to create their own custom collections to suit their business needs. The next permission, Allow Modification of Dashboards, allows users to adjust which widgets are displayed in their dashboards, as well as to construct new dashboards for their home screen. The item below this also relates to dashboards. Users with the Allow Modification of Widgets permission enabled are able to create their own widgets or custom items to add to their dashboards, such as reports, tables, and counters. Finally, this section is where you can select whether the users in this group will be able to create or edit their own combined reports. Combined reports allow the user to download multiple reports from different tables as a single Excel file, with each report as a separate sheet. These options are not visible on the screen for end user groups. Now let's take a look at a few more options on the General tab of the Group wizard. In the General tab, we can decide which tables the users in this group will have admin access to. Giving users admin access allows them to modify the permissions and setup for the tables on which they serve as admin. You can give access to 1, 2, or any number of tables, or simply click the System Admin at the bottom to give access to all tables. Giving a user group admin rights to a table allows them to take full ownership of that table and to define the ways in which the table is used without having to give them admin access to the whole system. However, this permission should be reserved for trained users. The second tab of the Group Configuration Wizard is the Tables tab. On this tab, you can configure the individual permissions to each of the tables in the system. This includes setting the visibility of the table, the level of access users will have, and even individual record and field level permissions. Clicking on the Edit icon next to the table record will allow you to access the deeper permissions record for this table as regards this particular group. Let's take a closer look at these deeper, more specific permissions for a table within this group. So at the top of the tab, we can see that we are setting permissions for the contract table for the group contract creator. So we can always keep an eye on what aspect of the system we are modifying. From here, we can set individual permissions for various aspects and functions of the table we selected. First, we can set the ability of the users in this group to create and edit saved searches. Next, we can set whether this group has permission to edit or create new views for the table. If they have permission to edit and create views, you can then select whether they can make those views available to other users by publishing them, and if they can create views that have quick edit options. Next, we see the email options. We can select whether they can send emails, and we can give them the ability to create, edit, and delete email templates. An email template is a pre-made message that incorporates field values from specific records. Finally, we can select whether the users can send email templates. You can allow them to send only the templates they create, only those that are published, or all templates. On the Record Permissions tab, we can select the permissions specific to records in this table. This is where we can determine if users can create new records, either by selecting New, by importing records, or by copying existing records. At the top of this tab, we can also determine whether the group can delete records. We can allow them to delete their own records, records owned by other users, or records defined by a saved search. A lot of permissions in this menu rely on the ownership of records. If you want to know how this table defines ownership, just look to the top of the tab. We can see in this case that the record ownership is defined by the requester ID, so whoever requests this record is considered the owner. This is important to keep in mind when you consider who can work with their own records versus the records owned by others. Scrolling down, we can see the additional record permissions available. On the left side, we can determine which records can be edited. Both the Own and Others options can be filtered by a saved search to create more customized options. Keep in mind that if you are working with an end-user group, you will not have the ability to allow them to edit other people's contracts, as this is a restriction on end-user licenses. From this left box, we can also select whether these users should be able to perform other edit functions, such as mass editing records, linking records, and using the Quick Edit function. On the right side, we can adjust the view permissions. We can allow users within this group to view their own records, view the records of others, or to view some subset of these records by using a saved search. From this box, we can also select whether the users should be able to export multiple contracts as a file, and their permissions as regards data conversion. The next tab of the record determines the user's individual field permissions. Just because you have given a group permission to view or to edit a record does not mean you have to allow them to edit every field in that record. The same principle applies to editing other users' records and determining viewing permissions. You can also determine which fields should be available when a record is first created by users in this group. This is the place where you can set the most granular level of permissions. The screenshot here is an example of what the screen would look like for a power user group. For an end user, the fields in the far right, which grant permission to edit records owned by other users, will not be available. From here, you can see that you can select specific fields or groups of fields, which the user can view in their own record, which they can view upon creation of a new record, which they can edit in their own record, view in the records owned by others, or edit in the records owned by others. Now that we have walked through the Groups wizard, let's take a look at how teams are set up. When we access the Teams Setup wizard, the first place we are sent is the General tab. On this tab, we can set the name of the group. It is important to avoid the use of commas in team names, as the full list of teams is shared in the user record as a comma-separated list. You can also choose a parent team for the new team. Parent teams provide a way to group teams and make changes to multiple teams by making the change to the parent team. You can then optionally allow those changes to waterfall down to all the teams of which that team is a parent. Next, you can select the table view refresh rate. This is the frequency with which the user's view of the table is updated. Traditionally, this is set to never for most tables. When users edit records, create records, or move from table to table, the table view refreshes. This is typically sufficient for most applications. One example of when you might want a value other than never is if you had a support table with very time-sensitive records that were submitted periodically. Do keep in mind that automatically refreshing the table view will make the system think the user is active, whether they actually are or not. If the table refresh rate is set to a value smaller than the system value for timeout due to inactivity, which determines how quickly users are logged out when they stop working in the system, then the user will never be automatically logged out. This may be an intentional choice for some instances, but it can be a problem for users who operate on a floating license, since they will continue to use the floating license spot until they log themselves out or a system admin logs them out. Finally, the last thing we'll look at in this tab is the table view lock refresh rate. This determines how often the system looks at locked records to see if they're still in use. A record is locked when a user doesn't properly close out of the record by using the save or cancel buttons. This is in place to prevent simultaneous editing of records by multiple users, and this value selects how often the lock is reevaluated. We should also note that those last two options, the table view refresh and table view lock refresh, apply to users for whom their primary team is this team. Users can be in multiple teams, but these particular values are set by the selection of their primary team. The next tab of the Teams wizard we're going to look at is the Working Hours tab. This tab sets the hours that are counted for things like hours to complete approval, hours spent assigned to contract manager, and so on. For an example, if a user's working hours were 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., Monday through Friday, a record assigned to them at 3 p.m. on Friday and completed at 10 a.m. Monday would only count as taking 3 hours if you only consider their working hours. Using all hours would make the count 67 hours, which does not accurately represent the amount of time it took the user to complete the task. Here is an example of a saved search that utilizes the working hours for the user's team. This search will give us contracts whose end date is within 5 days of now, based on the working hours for the team. So, for example, if the team were set to a Monday through Friday schedule, this would not count weekends when making the calculation. The next tab, the Languages tab, sets exactly what its name implies. This will determine what languages should be available for this team. Once a language has been made available, the language selection can be changed from the drop-down menu in the upper right corner of the user interface. And the options that are available on that list will be determined by the choices selected in the team record. Next, we'll look at the Formats tab. The Formats tab allows you to set the date and time formats that users see. You can choose to show users a 24 or 12-hour clock and select specific aspects of the date format they see. This only affects the fields that are left to default format. If a specific format is selected for a field, that format will always be displayed regardless of what format is selected here. You can also set the date format to be different than even the field format when a print template is generated, by using the date format function. The Custom Fields tab allows us to determine where this team is visible. From here, we can set the team to active or inactive and determine whether this team can receive emails. In the General Information section, we can set whether the team will be visible in various drop-down lists of teams. For example, if we select the Contract/Document box, then this team will be available in the drop-down menu when selecting the approval team in Contract and Document Approval templates. From this tab, we can also see a list of all members of this team. We can add members from here, though we typically do so directly from the user's record. Now that we've looked at the structure of teams and how they are set up, let's explore a few examples of how we can leverage teams. Our first example is using a team to determine who receives certain notifications. Rather than having to change an email template every time we want to add or remove someone from the list of people notified when a contract is signed, we can create a contract notification team. Now we can simply add or remove existing users from that team, and the email template will adjust accordingly, only sending the notification email to users who are in the team at the time the notification goes out. Another example of how to leverage teams is the round-robin assignment functionality. If you had a set of users who you wanted to equally share an assignment load, you could create a team and assign all the users to that team. When a record needs to be assigned, you can do so through a round-robin assignment to members of the team you created. This will equally distribute the records across all the users of the team. Assigning this way also allows you to escalate the records to the leader of the team if certain deadlines or actions are not completed. In addition to determining notifications and assignments, teams can also be used to customize the user's experience within the system. There are several elements of the system look and feel that are determined by the user's team. The Power User interface, which governs the colors, fonts, and icons the user sees, is determined by team. The left pane is also determined by the user's team. This allows you to determine which tables are visible in the left pane based on the user's team assignment. From the left pane setup, you can also determine if users can access the My Assigned section, view their last opened records, and a variety of other settings. Home pages are also assigned based on team, so a user's team determines which home page they see upon logging in, and also which home pages they can navigate to from there. Home pages determine which widgets a user can see, which can give them access to charts, reports, tables, and key links, all from their home page as soon as they log in. A user's team also determines which views they can access. This allows you to set specific table views for each team based on the fields and information that would be most important to the team. For example, a team of users who are involved in processing contract renewals would likely need a view that included the end date of the contracts and the renewal type. On the other hand, a team of users whose job was to manage the accounts payable portion of the contract system would likely be much more interested in knowing about the amount of the contract and the payment options. Finally, a user's team also determines the action bar that they can access in each table. Action bars are where a user can access functions like mass editing multiple records at once, exporting records, importing records from a file, and other actions. Now that we have looked in depth at the functions of groups and teams, let's run through a quick list of the uses for groups and teams prior to moving on to discussing roles. Groups allow access to tables, fields, and deletions. They control the visibility of a table on the left pane. They determine the default user interface, whether they are a power or end user. They allow access to saved searches and admin access to tables. They allow the creation of saved searches, reports, and views. They allow the creation of print templates and email templates. They allow mass editing, converting, importing records. A group determines a user's availability of quick editing fields, and the exporting and printing of records. Teams, in comparison, determine the assigned look and feel scheme for the system, the assigned left pane, the assigned home page and widgets. They determine the default and available views for tables, and what format date fields will take. A team also determines email assignment and working hours. The team determines the table refresh rate and whether a user is eligible for round-robin assignment of specific records. A user's team also determines what action bar is available to them for specific tables, as well as access to system languages. Additional uses for groups includes visibility of tables in the end user interface. And teams would also determine filtering lists of users, for example, when assigning a user to a record. A team can also be used to generate specific end user interface branding, or for validations on data to determine whether the data matches the data that should be entered by a member of that team. Now let's take a look at a few examples of how groups and teams can be used together to construct the user's experience within the system. This first user, user 1, is a contract requester. They are assigned to the contract creator team and the contract creator group. This is the most basic default setup for our out-of-the-box contract management system. They are an end user, so they'll be submitting contract requests through the end user interface. The second user is a contract manager and an approver. As you can see, they are in the contract manager group and the approver group. They can edit contracts other people created and can approve contract records. Their primary team is contract management team, which means that they get the default homepage for contract managers. They are in the legal team, which means that the validation role in the approvals table will allow them to approve records assigned to legal. They are on the contract management team, so contracts can be directly assigned to them. As you can see, these teams and groups tend to come in pairs. We can see here that the user 1 is on the contract creator team and the contract creator group. User 2 is in the contract management team and in the contract manager group. This pair of related teams and groups is referred to as a role. Now that we have seen how these users interact with the system, let's define their roles. User 1 is working as a contract creator. This is their role, which defines both their group and their team. User 2 works within the bounds of the contract manager role and the legal team approver role. For this reason, they have two roles assigned to them, contract manager and legal team approver. Now let's examine a user's record and see how their record is affected by the roles they are assigned. We can see that this user is assigned to the contract management and legal team approver roles. This is reflected in how they are assigned to the approver and contract manager groups and the legal and contract management teams. This portion of the record also tells us whether the roles currently assigned to the user use an assigned license, which is important to know when determining license quantities and orders. Under Add or Remove Roles, we can do just that. We can add a new role to this user's record, which will assign both the group and team associated with the added role to the user's record. Or we can remove an existing role, which will remove the corresponding groups and teams. Finally, at the bottom, we can see a history of when roles were added or removed and who performed the action. Now that we know a little bit about what roles are used for, let's look at the roles table. By navigating to this table, we can see a list of the roles defined in the system. We can see the teams and groups associated with each of those roles, and we can see which groups they are available to. This Available to Groups field is used to determine which users can assign the role. For example, it would not make sense for someone in the approval group to be able to assign other people the admin role, since that comes with permissions far beyond those of the approval group. We can also see from this table view whether the role uses an assigned license, as well as whether the role is an active role in the system. The individual role records are typically created and managed by the system administrator, since they have the potential for assigning high-level permissions to users. For users who are in multiple roles, and thus multiple teams, the primary team is determined by a sort order field from within the team records. Before we wrap up today, let's look at a few of the more common ways that permissions are configured within the system. All of these groups are present in our out-of-the-box system. The first group we'll look at is the contract creator group. There are a few ways that this group can be configured. They can be configured to be able to see all contracts in the system. They can be set up to only be able to see the contracts that they submitted. Or they can be set up to see all contracts submitted to their department. Other configurations include being able to only see contracts that are marked as non-confidential. Another default group is the contract manager group. The contract managers can typically see and edit all contracts, but they can also be restricted to only edit contracts that are assigned to them. They can be configured to only edit records with status values before sign, or they can only see records of certain contract types based on your individual configuration. Contract managers can also be set up to only see records assigned to specific departments. If, for example, there were 3 departments that they managed, they would be able to see records assigned to those 3 departments. Approvers are another crucial group within the system. Some common configurations include approvers only seeing contracts that they are the approvers for, or only seeing attachments that they are directly approving. Some approvers can only see or edit approvals for their own team, and other approvers can see and edit all approvals for the contract that they are approving. Additional groups that are commonly added include a contract reporter. This group can only see contracts for active and expired contracts. Often they can view all contracts but can edit none of them. And they frequently have permission to create reports and export them. Contract assigners are another popular group. These can be configured to only see contracts with a pending assignment status, or they can be configured to only edit the internal contract owner field, thus serving the role of assigning a contract without being able to change the content of that contract. Another example of a custom configuration, sometimes implemented with contracts, is the concept of a confidential contract. In this case, a confidential contract is defined by this confidential contract checkbox at the top of the record. Underneath that, the user is able to list who can see the contract. And below that, the user is able to list departments that are able to see the contract. Now, when setting up the visibility permissions for the contracts table, we can say that a user can see a contract if confidential contract equals false, meaning that box is not checked, or if their name is in the list of users who are allowed to see the contract, or if their department is contained in the list of departments who have permission to view the contract. By setting the contract up this way, we're able to restrict specific contracts to only be visible by groups or departments that are specified within the contract record, thus containing more tight control of visibility or editability of the contract. Thank you so much for joining us today as we look at groups, teams, roles, and how they all tie in together to create an overall picture of permissions for the system. We will have time for Q&A after this session. Thanks for joining and have a wonderful day.
Thanks to the recorded version of Rose, and now we welcome Jack for our Q&A. I'll start with one we've been getting. We are going to send out a recording. Some of you are having audio issues, so we'll be sure to send out a clean version with clean audio within 24 or 48 hours. Okay, here we have one for you, Jack. I have an earlier release of Agiloft. Can I use the roles functionality?
Yeah, so you can definitely use the roles functionality. It just has to be built out in your system. The best way of getting it would be to speak directly to your implementer or customer service rep, or you could submit a ticket in the actually you could submit an imp task in your support portal, and it's very quick for us to add into your system.
Great. We've got one from Jackie here. Can you walk through again how to set up a confidential contract? I don't see that option in the contract record, so I need to know how to add that.
Yeah, so the sort of had that one screen at the end of the presentation talking about confidential contracts. That was sort of an idea of how to set up confidential contracts. So basically, you'll need some fields in the contract record itself to define who can see that contract. I've done that by having a list of people. So a field type that would be linked to selected, multiple values enabled, a list of people who can see a contract, or maybe you want to define it by a team or a department. But once you've got that field that contains that list of people or teams or departments in your contract record, you can then go to the permissions of your various groups that you want to be able to hide certain contracts from, and you can edit that permission group and go to the contracts table for that permission group and say that this user or this group of users can only see contracts that have their name or their team or their department within that new confidential contract field that you've added. So it's sort of a two-step process. First, you add the field that contains who you want to be able to see the confidential contract, and then you go edit their groups to modify their permissions to say, okay, you can only see the contracts when you are contained in this field. So sort of a two-part process there. And it can get more complex if you have maybe you have two fields, such you've got a list of people who can see the contract and also a list of teams. And if you're in either of those, then you can see the contract. So it can get as complicated as you want it to get. But the most basic way of doing it is a list of people in the contract record, and then the permissions are edited to say you can only see the contract if you're in that list of people.
Great. So what are some things that people can do to find more ways to do this? Is there documentation available, or where can people learn more about roles and permissions?
Yeah, so definitely our wiki is the best place to find this information. So if you go to wiki.agiloft.com, you can get to our standard system documentation, and in there, I mean, it's worth reading through most of this, but in there is a section on permissions, there's a section on groups, there's a section on roles, on user records. It's really worth reading those pages and getting some background information on everything that we covered today.
Great. Yeah, I see one more. I manage permissions using Active Directory. Should I start using roles?
So if you're already managing permissions through Active Directory, then I would advise not starting to use roles. And the reasons are that the sort of the two main benefits of roles are one, that it will that you put someone in a role and it chooses their group and it puts them into a team automatically, so you're only managing one thing. And with our Active Directory setup, the Active Directory group actually translates already into a group and a team, so you don't need so sort of that benefit of roles is void. And then the other benefit of using roles is that other non-admin users can manage other users' permissions within Agiloft. And if you're managing permissions through Active Directory, then you don't need that benefit of the roles either. So if you're already doing permissions through Active Directory, I would advise to continue doing that and to not switch to use the roles table.
Great. Well, that looks like all the questions we have for today. If you have one real quick, send it our way. But thanks, Jack, and thanks to Rose for putting together this training session. If you like this one, this is a part of our Agiloft webinar series. Go to our website, agiloft.com, to see what's coming up. Next week, we're going to be talking to our new CEO, Eric Laughlin, about his plans for Agiloft in the coming months and years. So you won't want to miss that one. Thanks, everyone, and hopefully see you next week.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Thanks, everyone.